Split brain research. So hemispheric lateralization, and this is the idea that two hemispheres of the brain are functionally different. Certain mental processes and behaviors are mainly controlled by one hemisphere rather than the other. An example of this would be the language. Language, which is subject to hemispheric lateralization, as the ability to produce and understand language is controlled by the left hemisphere. Split brain studies by Sperry. Sperry used a group of epileptic patients who had undergone a commissurotomy, which is where the corpus callosum and other tissues are removed in order to separate the two hemispheres. This meant that the main communication line between the two hemispheres was removed and allowed researchers to investigate to which extent brain function was lateralized. Procedure. An image or object was presented to the patient's right visual field, which is processed in the left hemisphere, and the same or different image was presented to the patient's left visual field, which is processed by the right hemisphere. In a normal brain, the corpus callosum would share the information between both hemispheres and there would be a complete picture. However, presenting the image to one hemisphere of a split brain patient meant that the information could not be conveyed from that hemisphere to another. Key findings describing what you see. From the right visual field, they could easily describe what is seen. The same object and left visual field, they couldn't describe what was seen and typically reported that there was nothing there. Language is processed in the left hemisphere, so patients' ability to describe objects displayed to the left visual field, processed by the right hemisphere, was due to the lack of language centers in the right hemisphere. In a normal brain, messages in the right hemisphere would be relayed to language centers in the left hemisphere. Key findings: recognition by touch. They could not describe objects but could select matching object from a grab bag of different objects using their left hand, which is processed by the right hemisphere. Left hand was also able to select an object most closely related with an object in the left visual field, so for example an ashtray in response to a picture of a cigarette. In each case, the patient was not able to identify what they had seen but could understand what the object was using their right hemisphere, which is their left hand, and select the corresponding object accordingly. Key findings: composite words. Two words are presented simultaneously to both visual fields. So, for example, the image below, patient would write with their left hand, which is processed by the right hemisphere, key, and say the word left hemisphere ring. Key findings: matching faces. The right hemisphere appeared dominant in terms of recognizing faces. When patients had to match a face from a series of other faces, the picture processed by the right hemisphere, which is the left visual field, was consistently selected, and the picture presented to the left hemisphere, right visual field, was consistently ignored. When an image made up of two different halves of a face was presented, one to each hemisphere, the left hemisphere dominated in terms of verbal description, and the right hemisphere dominated in terms of selecting a matching picture. AO3. Generalizability. So only 11 participants took part, of whom had a history of epileptic seizures. This may have caused unique changes in the brain that may have influenced the findings. Therefore, you can't generalize the results to people without epilepsy, which reduces the external validity of the research. A strength is the key contribution. So it demonstrated how the left hemisphere is geared for verbal and analytic tasks, and the right is adept for spatial tasks in music. This has added key contributions towards understanding of the function of the brain, which can be used for treatments for those who suffer brain damage, giving lateralization real life application. Another strength is the standardization. One eye would be blindfolded and the image would only be shown for a tenth of a second, preventing the patient from moving their eye and spreading the image across both visual fields. This ensured only one hemisphere processed the information, developing a controlled procedure, and this increases reliability. One weakness is overstatement. So neuroscientists have shown there isn't clear distinction in functions. Both hemispheres can effectively perform tasks that the other specializes in. It shows that Perry oversimplified the functional difference of the hemispheres, which decreases the validity of Sperry's findings.